Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Vishvapani. Some of you may know him, some of you may know his work, and some of you, like me, have probably heard his voice over the airways on the Today programme for many years. He's given us a break from shouting at the politicians. And he's, I believe, first came across meditation when he was 14, and he's a bit older than that now, so some years, I guess, been meditating, and has become, I guess, very influential in the field of mindfulness and what we call the mindfulness revolution. And you're currently involved in an all-parliamentary group on mindfulness and some mindfulness research as well in the Welsh Parliament. Is that right?
I'll be talking about that.
That's fantastic. I hoped you'd be talking about that. Also described himself as a writer and a Buddhist teacher, and has been a member of the Triratna Buddhist order since 1982. So, pardon? Is that right? 92. Been involved since 1980. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so over to you, Vishvapani.
Okay, well, good afternoon to everyone. You'll do the admitting people who show up now, will you? I'll just close the participants back. Yes, so welcome to everyone who's here. And I was really looking forward to the in-person bit of the festival. You know, I often think that with conferences and festivals and events like that, it's the bit where you all hang around and have lunch together, where you connect, where you, in a way, those are the most enjoyable bits, and then the talks are the bits that happen in between. So it's, I'm sorry we're not doing that. And I hope we don't just go into a sort of conference mode where it's all rather passively listening. I'm going to be talking about mindfulness, going to be talking about my work, and I'm going to be relating it to the middle way. But I'd like to suggest that we start with a few minutes of just sitting quietly. And this is really part and parcel of what I have to say, which is about the importance of taking our minds, our mental states, ourselves into account in whatever we do, including listening to a talk. So I imagine many of you have done this sort of thing before, but I won't assume that you have. So I'll give a little light guidance. And if you haven't done it before, it'll be an experience of what I'm talking about later on. So we just find a way to sit that's comfortable, but also upright. Maybe letting our back come away from the back of the chair. And just asking ourselves what will help us to feel really present right now. And part of that might be noticing the extent to which we're engaged with our thoughts. Perhaps thoughts about talks we've heard today, or what we had for lunch just now, something like that. So one thing that can help us to feel present is to feel the body. So just sensing the feet touching the floor, bottom resting on the chair. Spine rising up. I'm noticing that the body is moving. Maybe taking a deeper breath, breathing out, settling, releasing. Becoming present. And then just starting to move a little. Roll your shoulders. When you're ready, opening your eyes. So that's just a short settling, arriving practice. As we say, we teach mindfulness. It's really about just being present. And I mentioned earlier on, I mentioned as I was leading it, that when we encourage ourselves to be present, we notice the extent to which we aren't. And there are many levels of that, of being present with what's happening, just in a very obvious sense, listening to the words we're hearing, being aware of our bodies, just in an abstracted state. These are important themes. We'll be coming back to them. So, I don't know if Robert's here. I can't see him, or Stephen either. I was just reflecting as I was listening to Robert's talk earlier on today. The first time I met Robert, who is, if you don't know, is the founder of the Middle Way Society. He's written all the books. I first met Robert 35 years ago when we were in the same English literature tutorial group at Cambridge University. And I should say he was just the same then as he is now. Sort of 19-year-old version. And we've been friends ever since. For a while, Robert was a member of the same Buddhist order that I'm a member of, and then he left. But thinking back to that time as a student and studying, the question that my studies left me with was how what I was studying, particularly literature, could make a difference to my life. And also how what we were studying, starting with novels, but in coming and poems and so on, but approaching them in increasingly abstract ways, how that could also relate to the wider world. And there are various answers to that, many of which are quite alive in the academy, not the ones I have sympathy for on the whole. And I'm going to be speaking about the way that my life, my work has turned out, the way where I've gone, which is engagement with mindfulness, the mindfulness movement, which I've learned both from the Buddhist tradition and as a mindfulness teacher, and that's my day job. And I'm going to suggest, with some important caveats, how that can be a force for social change and how it can work in conjunction with the very helpful principles that are there in the middle way approach to philosophy and thought. Now, I was also listening to Stephen earlier on, and the last time I saw Stephen, I've known Stephen quite a long time as well, but the last time I saw him was actually in the very odd surroundings of the Houses of Parliament, which, as Nina was saying, I've been involved in a group that's worked with the all-party parliamentary mindfulness group over a number of years. People sometimes laugh when they hear that term, but it does exist. And Stephen, along with John Peacock, convened a meeting where a group of us were discussing, is mindfulness value free? So mindfulness has come into society. It's become a social movement and come, as I'll be suggesting, a very interesting social movement. But is it simply a technique? Is it a stress management technique or something like that, which has been divorced from an ethical basis? So that's what we talked then. That group, partly informed by such discussions, shaped a policy agenda for the Westminster Parliament that was focused on interventions for mental health and education, as well as criminal justice and the workplace. And we produced a document called the Mindful Nation UK Report. I was one of the editors on that. So there's been further developments, particularly the spread of engagement with mindfulness in parliaments around the world. I'm part of a network of, I think there are people from 25 groups of mindfulness teachers who engage with their parliaments or their governments. Mostly parliaments, and it's mostly teaching mindful MPs, etc., to meditate. So that has some value. They talk about a more mindful politics. The evidence of that is we're still waiting to see, I think, really. Over the last year, I've taken this much further in Wales, where I live, and working with the Welsh government. And the Welsh government we've moved from just advocating policies to really implementing them. And the government in Wales is actively supporting an agenda around bringing mindfulness into a whole range of areas of society, particularly education and health. So that in a way is quite interesting. I hope that's interesting to you. It's not very widely known that that's happening. But I'm really going to use that as a basis for reflection on the kind of issues that arise when we start to bring mindfulness into something that's really meaningful in terms of having a wide-scale social effect. And for those of you who aren't particularly engaged with mindfulness, but maybe are interested in philosophy or middle way philosophy, I think there are parallel questions. Now, it's all very well for us to have our ideas about what we think is a good thing, but what really happens when you try to implement that? And there are a number of questions that have been posed of this mindfulness movement, which of which I've become part. So one set of questions, actually Stephen raised them at that meeting, and many other Buddhists have raised them. So mindfulness as a societal practice is divorced from Buddhism and its Buddhist sources. I mean, we can talk about mindfulness in Christianity and so on, but it's also divorced from those. And what that means is it's stripped of a context of ethics. Hence the question, is it value free? It's stripped from any particular relationship with beliefs. It's a pragmatic practice. And in principle, you can be a mindfulness practitioner and hold any beliefs whatsoever. And there have been examples of Nazi mindfulness, but actually do quite a lot of work in the criminal justice system. I encountered such a person, a charming fellow. But no, I mean, genuinely, not ironically, he was lovely, but he was a Nazi. And so, yes, there are obvious questions when mindfulness is taken out of a context which implies a critique of beliefs. what is left, and how can that be effective? Meanwhile, there's a left-wing social science-based perspective on it and critique. You may have heard of the derogatory term for what some of us do, which is mindfulness, and the sort of commoditization of a spiritual practice into a form which can be profited and used in various ways by capitalist systems. And this is quite a well-developed critique now. I hear it quite a lot. That capitalism will subvert and co-opt even the most benign practice to its ends. And by the way, I don't see why the same wouldn't apply to middle way philosophy. I don't see, you can be making your judgments without absolutes, but if you're doing it within a social system that tends to use any such approach, why then wouldn't that apply? So, but that approach hasn't been made, that critique hasn't been made of middle way philosophy, but it's certainly been made of mindfulness. My work has mainly been with the public sector. And so I personally find this mindfulness critique interesting but alien to anything that I actually experience. But within the public sector, the question for me is whether mindfulness can really be a force for change and meaningful transformation in those sectors. Or will we simply be offering courses in compassion and awareness within systems which are uncompassionate and unaware? Or can there be some sort of systemic change that occurs? And actually, it's quite a privilege to even be able to, and rather strange, to even be able to pose that as a serious question. I'm so used through my time as a Buddhist to being on the periphery of these sorts of discussions, as part of an alternative social grouping, and engage with an alternative practice. And these questions arise because mindfulness has become mainstream. So for the sake of engaging more than just the realm of concepts, I want to relate a story that a friend of mine told me, or a Buddhist who I met and got to know, called Vishvapani. Now, she is a pediatrician in New Zealand, a consultant pediatrician. And so her work involves, as doctors' works do, going around the ward and going from case to case, surrounded by a gaggle of nurses, junior doctors, trainees, who are interacting with her, and she's interacting with the patient. So Vishvapani told me that she got to a point where she realized she could not operate as she wanted to operate, because everyone's in a slightly hyped up state, hurrying her from person to person, giving her all sorts of notes, asking all sorts of questions, the students asking questions, etc. But between patients, the regulation stated that she needed to spend 30 seconds washing her hands. So this is something that has become familiar to many more of us. We've been asked to wash our hands a lot. And so she recognized that this was an opportunity to be mindful. And she made a rule on her ward rounds that no one was allowed to talk to her while she was washing her hands. and they didn't like it to start with, but then they got used to it. And what that did for her was it enabled her to move from one patient to the next patient, and when she got to the next patient, to be fully present, to do what she wanted to do, which was to give them her full attention and to engage with them as an individual, not number 3 on a list of cases as she went around the world. You get the picture. I just tell you that story because I think it's such a lovely illustration of how mindfulness can make a difference. And the difference in the quality of care is a qualitative difference. You know, it's not just whether a doctor has the right skills, it's how they interact and the quality of their engagement. So I'm just going to leave you with that image and now go back to the more general material about mindfulness movement and really what I think it signifies. So this has happened fairly quickly and on a really huge scale with tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people in developed countries learning meditation practices. We also, you know, those who get a more detailed training learn certain attitudes that go along with that. And that's really, if you're interested in social change, that's really interesting. There's a reason for this, and there's an opportunity there. At least this is how I think. So mindfulness has emerged as an accessible way, I suggest, of addressing the distinctive suffering of the modern condition. So coronavirus has actually changed our perspective on this. But on the whole, we tend to think less about physical challenges, having enough to eat. This is in the developed world now. And more about our emotional and mental health challenges. And mindfulness appeals because it offers ways of addressing our states of mind. So in a world that's filtered by technology, mindfulness helps us to be in contact with our body and senses. In a society that offers endless choices, mindfulness fosters the value of stillness. In workplaces which are shaped by instrumental goals, by how many this, that, or the other you can achieve in a certain length of time, mindfulness values the space in which other qualities can emerge. In a global marketplace, mindfulness encourages us not to compare ourselves and to foster a sense of contentment. And the same with, in a world that offers consumer solutions to our dissatisfaction, mindfulness points very all and offers ways to access alternative sources of contentment. All of these things, these sources of distress, have been accentuated, I think, by coronavirus, COVID-19. I've been doing quite a lot of online teaching, so this is becoming very familiar to me, actually. Running drop-in sessions, running courses, moving my old courses online. This is quite interesting as a way to then reach out into the worlds as so many people see their kitchen cabinets, their bedroom furniture, and to hear their testimonies, hear their experience, hearing from health professionals under huge pressure, especially in nursing homes, where they're seeing a wave of not only the things we hear about in the news, but just the impact of, if you're in a nursing home with 20 residents and 10 of them die, what that does to you. Older people who are self-isolating and may have to do this for really quite a long time, possibly a year. And often self-isolating with their families or perhaps their partner, and the tensions that brings to that relationship. The one woman I've been engaging with is isolating in a shared house in London with people she really doesn't know. And anyway, I won't comment any more on that, but it's very difficult, and quite dramatic situations. People with mental health problems whose anxiety has been magnified by the prevalence of genuine things to worry about. In some cases, actually, that seems to be helping. It seems that they feel less alone with their anxiety. But clearly, there's going to be a wave of mental health problems that's a very serious issue, and that will come after the first wave, which is physical health problems. The second wave, which is economic challenges, well, we'll be left with a legacy of mental health problems from all of this. And mindfulness is formulated in a way that's accessible and effective. It's moving beyond the theory of what people in society need and engaging with people. And, over the last 10 years, I've done that in many ways, many sectors of society. And there's a huge social experiment going on now with mindfulness, which I can't do justice to. I won't even try to describe it. I'll just let you assume that you have some awareness of this. So I want to move now to the work we've been doing with the Welsh Government. So a year ago, a group of us met with Mark Drakeford, who's the First Minister of Wales. He's not very well known. He's not particularly charismatic. He hasn't been the First Minister for very long. But he's remarkably intelligent. He was a social science professor in Cardiff University before he went into politics. And he's exceptionally thoughtful, I would say. And he's the one who's really given us his permission to engage with the government, and he's given the government permission to engage with us. And there's quite a good fit. So a foundational piece of legislation in Wales is called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Again, this is very interesting and deserves to be much better known. It states that every action of the Welsh Government should accord with a range of well-being of future generations criteria. These include sustainability, inclusion, and long-term thinking. So there's an obvious fit there, and there's been some interesting work going on with mindfulness and behavior change and behavioral economics for the government around how they, how they need to change how they think in order to really embed these well-being of future generations goals. In health, we're seeing a gradual evolution of place of mindfulness. Mindfulness is one of the recommended interventions. So what's happening in health in Wales isn't particularly distinctive, but it is happening. But mindfulness is part of a much wider revolution in the education system in Wales. A new curriculum is being formulated and gradually introduced. It will be how Welsh education runs from 2022, which focuses on pupil progression rather than assessment. So there are 6 areas of learning excellence, and one of these is health and well-being, which means that health and well-being is as important as literacy or numeracy in the new curriculum. And this is assessed through, as I said, through progression steps, which are specified. Now, If you look, you can look all this up at some point. The progression step 5, which is where health and well-being is heading. I'll just read you some of the headings for what schools are being asked to do. They're asked to educate students to understand these following things. I can use my self-awareness to appreciate the complexity of my emotions and apply strategies to self-regulate them in a healthy way and connect with others. I can use my self-awareness to appreciate the complexity of my emotions. Sorry, I just said that. I can empathize with others, which helps me be compassionate and kind towards myself and others, and so on. So this is very interesting, isn't it, as an educational goal. And it is raising very big questions for the schools, for the school system. So with my colleagues, we're working with people right across education, including school leaders. And everyone is asking, how will this work? It's all very well for the government to say, we need to turn our education system into something that fosters emotional intelligence. And then secondly, to say that we're not going to prescribe this from the center in terms of a fixed curriculum, and that schools need to create their own curriculum and their own approaches to how they want to do this. So they love those ideas, but they are really not sure how they're going to do that. It's a very big ask, because the schools are being asked to adopt, to do something new, to engage with skills that they don't necessarily have. And all of these qualities are meant to be done across the curriculum. How does maths foster those qualities of emotional intelligence? So we're working all this out. And I don't have developed answers on how mindfulness can support that sort of social change. Mindfulness can certainly come into the schools as an intervention. It can be something that, we can run courses on, mindfulness courses for kids. We can do that as a spiral curriculum where they gradually develop these skills. They learn to self-soothe. They learn to explore their emotions. You can do all of that sort of thing. But it's really asking the institutions themselves to think and operate differently. And that's taking us into an area where we have many more questions and answers. But I'm going to just offer some reflections on a mindful approach to social change, broadening this out a little from the specific issues that we're encountering in Wales. The first point is that mindfulness is a significant social movement. It deserves serious attention. And what it's doing is it's introducing the realm of the mind and mental states to discussions of how we think about society. It's doing this in a practical way that turns out to be surprisingly accessible to people and can be very meaningful. And a lot of the debates that we're having with people from a Marxist and sociological perspective critiquing mindfulness seem to me that we need to respond to that critique by reminding sociological friends that their approach, for all its incisiveness, lacks that perspective on the mind and emotions and mental states. And this has been quite a profound reflection for some people in the socialist movement. People such as Richard Layard, who've been guiding the development of the welfare state over many years, and come to ask why it is that indices of happiness, satisfaction, and well-being haven't risen, even though living standards have risen. So there's quite a profound question there about the need for engaging well-being, and mindfulness being a very important part of that. The power of this movement comes from what it offers individuals, because it addresses what we care about most. And to my friends here who are engaged with middle way philosophy and wanting to use that as a way to influence society, I commend to you the following thought, that what people care about most is their suffering. Mindfulness has come in as mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for depression. When you're locked in those sorts of mental states, you're willing to try new things. And if they work, you can really you're willing to go very deeply into them. You're willing to change habits if it turns out that those habits are causing you to suffer. The rest is in risks remaining in the domain of theory. Becomes real when emotions are engaged. So this is, I think, a challenge for the more theoretical presentations of middle way. How can we engage emotion in this? And mindfulness is developing as a movement because it does engage people's emotions, particularly certain individuals who become champions, who become very passionate, taken into their workplaces, taken into their schools. And for those of you who are Buddhists here, I recognize a few friends. Another way of a parallel is the role that dukkha, or suffering, plays at the outset of the Buddhist path, notwithstanding what Stephen Batchelor was saying this morning. It's the first of the Four Noble Truths. Now, this does mean that mindfulness appeals to us, to people on the level of individuals. And this is my third point now. This is also a limitation because individuals exist within communities, societies, and social systems. Social forces can overwhelm individual efforts to change and shape our values to their ends. So this is a mindfulness critique. And as it happens, Mark Drakeford we had a conference last autumn. Mark Drakeford came, and it was very interesting to see how he engaged with us. I mean, us being a lot of the senior members of the civil service, senior people in health service and social services and education, as well as mindfulness teachers. And he didn't say mindfulness was a good thing or a bad thing or part of Welsh government policy. What he did was he offered us 3 challenges. The first challenge was that everything we did should be evidence-based. He said that his experience in public services was that people often did things with very good intentions, but without a basis in evidence, they couldn't really get very far. Secondly, he said that it was important that we address individuals as members of communities and not in isolation. And that's quite an important insight that can shape. It's shaping, I mean, that principle is partly shaping how the government is working in Wales. And it can shape how we can engage with school communities, with public health and so on. And thirdly, that we should address the causes and not just the symptoms of social suffering. So if mindfulness comes in as a way to make people feel better when their suffering where their position in society is bound up with their suffering, and that position is as part of an unequal and unjust social system, then it's not enough to help people accommodate themselves to that reality. Yes? So we need to address the causes. Now, at some point, I start to feel, well, I'm just a mindfulness teacher. I don't know how to save the world and change it. You're the politician. Can't you do all that stuff? But what it really means is that in bringing mindfulness into these systems like health and education, we're engaging with an ethos that is alive to these things. And so we need to be alive to what the context. Mindfulness in itself fosters certain attitudes, and that I think does bring some kind of content to the values and the ethics, and maybe the approach to social change that we have. And most of us involved in this project feel very sympathetic to Mark Drakeford's project. But I also note that our new Attorney General, Suella Braverman, is also a Buddhist, also a mindfulness practitioner. In fact, she's a member of my own Buddhist community. And she is a strong political ally of Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab, and a whole host of people with whom I feel very little sympathy. So I've reflected on this over the last few years, actually, as Suella Braverman's career has developed, and just really highlighted to me that the gap between the shared principles that I think, you know, people like Buddhists and mindfulness practitioners and so on hold, and what that looks like as a political program. You know, I also notice how most of my Buddhist and mindfulness friends make the assumption that their practices will, their political views are married to the basis in their practice. Their political views are, generally speaking, left of centre, as are mine, and that therefore people who do these practices should share those views. And it turns out that people who have different political views have a very different view, a perspective on that. So that's quite interesting. I also think that's true of middle way philosophy. You may assume that middle way philosophy would bring a certain kind of political program, but I wonder how firm that assumption is. So, I do think that mindfulness adds something from its own side. My definition of mindfulness is actually very simple. I've done a lot of work in places like prisons and things like that, and I've really tried to simplify things down. One part of what we're learning with mindfulness is the capacity to calm the mind, at least calm it enough to gain emotional and cognitive clarity, or greater emotional cognitive clarity. Another part is using that calmer mind, that greater mental space, to gain perspective on our experience. Traditionally, this includes thoughts and feelings, and also in psychological contexts includes that primarily. And the mindfulness movement emphasizes rooting experience in the body and the present moment, but it can also include insights into a range of frameworks. The key is that combination of calm and perspective. Without fostering a sense of calm, the greater perspective can't come. And that, for me, is the really distinctive thing that I want my work in the mindfulness movement to foster. A sense of bringing a depth of calm into a process of reflection. I also think that it needs to be supplemented by a critique of judgment, and I am very sympathetic to Robert's approach with the middle way philosophy in doing that. I'm going to have another go at making this specific, or showing the difference that this means to how we think. Over the past 3 decades, targets and goals and assessment regimes have been the levers through which government has managed public services, and managing public services is one of the main things that government does. We're now seeing a backlash to that, and the Welsh Government education policy, which I talked about, is a part of that backlash. But let's just reflect on goals. I mainly teach mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or my MBCT, which is based on the psychological discovery of the role of goal setting in depression. So low mood and difficult emotions are treated, we engage with them when we're feeling depressed as problems to be solved. And we measure our actual experience against an imagined goal. We judge ourselves for failing to meet that goal, and then we ruminate on that failure. That roughly is the mechanism that powers depression. So mindfulness teachers offer ways to counteract that by staying with actual experience rather than trying to fix it, and engaging with it even if it's difficult or painful. We encourage people to notice the judgments that they make about good, bad, good enough, bad, not good enough, without believing those judgments, and that's where the mental space enables that. And we settle awareness on the present moment and how things are rather than how we want them to be. So now if we hypothesize or analogize social structures and organizations to what psychologists tell us about dysfunctional psychological mechanisms, then we can see that a target culture is going to have an effect on an organization comparable to the effect of depression, anxiety, stress. And that's what I've been told so many times over so many years by so many people who work in those fields. So we need to get away from targets. Yes, we need to get away from goals. And that is actually where the Welsh Government's heading. But I wonder if it's as simple as that. And I wonder if there's a middle way that can help us. Let's go back to Akshobani, to the pediatrician who's washing her hands between patients. So yes, washing our hands is a way to be present and to let go of a desire to get through people as quickly as possible, and all that sort of thing. But in that example, there's a very clear goal. There's a very clear intention, which is to help people, to be present. That is an intention. And the idea is that that will bring a better standard of care, which you could actually measure. So it's not that goals are bad in themselves. It's not that there's anything wrong with targets in themselves. What we really require is not to let go of our goals, but a different attitude towards them. So one of the Buddhist sources for the middle way is the Sona Sutta, about a discourse about someone called Sona. And so Sona, according to the extended version of this story, was so committed to walking meditation that his feet bled. And he's incredibly, he meditates incredibly hard, whatever that means. And then he has a big backlash and he feels like giving up. Is this familiar to anyone? So the Buddha takes him aside and says, well, Sona, you were a musician before in lay life, before you started doing this Buddhist monk thing. When you tuned the strings of a lute, what happened when they were too loose? Well, there was no music. What happened when they were too tight? And it didn't work. What happened when they were neither too tight nor too slack? Well, then the lute, the harp, was sitar, perhaps we should say, was resonant and playable. And so this image of a lute or harp strings that are well tuned is an image for about what in Buddhism we call balanced effort. And that's the key to practice. The effort is important, but it has to be balanced, not too much, not too little. And then the interesting thing, if you go back to the analogy of the lute, is that an instrument that's properly tuned turns out to operate according to the laws of harmonics. So it's not that just you have a scale of pleasant notes, you have notes that are no longer dissonant, they become resonant. And then music becomes possible, not just as the accumulation of notes, but as something greater than that, because the notes work together. So in other words, this I think is quite an important insight into what we're talking about with the middle way in Buddhism, that it's, as Robert likes to say, it's not just a compromise, it's not just a halfway point, but it's actually something which accords with a deeper reality. In the case of music, it's the reality of harmonics. And that's where I think we need to head. And then going back to the public services, that's where perhaps there's a balance between an overemphasis on targets and an underemphasis. So that's an image for balanced pragmatism, if you like. So implementing all these, this is all very interesting, isn't it? All very well, but implementing these ideas, whatever approaches, whatever philosophical approach we might have, requires awareness. It requires of us the space to pause, to reflect, to resist the pressure of the situation, the group, comparisons we make with other people, with our habits, with our reactivity. More than being calm or present, mindfulness is really the capacity to do that. And as a societal movement, mindfulness is training many thousands of people in our society to do that, to resist the law, resist the pull of habit and reactivity. Just going to make a comment to conclude about coronavirus, COVID-19. All those plans we had, do you remember them? Those of you who've been organising this festival, all those meetings you had about how it would be and where we would have it and all the rest of it. They just disappeared, along with all of the things in my diary that made the summer look so inviting and exciting and interesting. Now replaced in my Gmail diary with a whole blank space. The coronavirus has shattered our plans and our assumptions like a bubble. It's shattered the illusion that we are invulnerable to nature, that we are impervious to sickness. We now inhabit an unfamiliar space where the bubble has burst, as the Diamond Sutra says. And we can imagine fresh ways of living and fresh starts and all the rest of it. But this crisis also halted the momentum behind, for example, climate activism. And in the coming economic crisis, the pressure will be to return as quickly as possible to the reliable sources of economic growth that will enable us to repay the debts that we are currently accruing on such a vast scale. If we're not to fall into that trap collectively, we need to see the patterns into which our behaviour falls. and to see its roots in the mind. And we need a movement to do that right now, to help people manage the stress of lockdown as mental health issues spiral, and an approach that points to the mind as a source of stability and security. And only that, I believe, will help us prevent the return to business as usual, which was in fact a crisis in its own right. So I've gone a little bit over my time, and I'm going to stop there.
Sorry, having problems with my unmute button there. Thank you very, very much for that very wide-ranging talk and lots of questions. You may have noticed some questions coming up as we went through, and I mean, I think that the reflectiveness of those questions is perhaps an indication of where your talk took people. They're not short questions.
No. Yeah, I'm just looking
and not easy to answer questions. But Robin asked some time ago, what resistance do you meet in your daily life to mindfulness, on whatever level you want to take that, in terms, I guess, in Parliament, with politicians, with school teachers? Is there a cynicism, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's that there is a cynicism, and that's not never surprising. But what surprises me is the degree of openness among many people, and of course that's not everyone, and how quickly this is changing as the years go by. I see Robin's question there. I see various questions about, is mindfulness enough? And I mean, what I think is that it really needs to go with a much wider systemic change. And then I think mindfulness can play a role. And that's why it's interesting in Wales. Because when you have an education curriculum that's asking the whole school to be emotionally aware and emotionally intelligent, and that's a sort of compelled from above by the government, then it becomes a necessity to do that. And then those champions who are personally invested have a hearing. Without that sort of systemic support, I think it's much harder, it becomes much more fragmentary.
And you have made the point all the way through that the technique itself is not anchored to any particular point of view.
No.
And it's certainly, I would agree with you that it's the same for middle way philosophy, and that I guess my wish, and I'm sure Robert's wish, is that people become more flexible in their thinking by using these. Would you say that you have a similar wish for mindfulness? That would be.
Yes, I mean, another point I was making through the talk was that I think focusing on judgments is one side of it. I don't want to set these against each other, actually. Focusing on judgments is one side of things. Focusing on engaging emotions is another side of things. And what I think is so powerful about mindfulness as a movement in these contexts is that it does that, engages people's emotions, especially when they've experienced emotional suffering. Now, I think there's a lot for us to explore in how this, the middle way approach of looking at judgment can go along with that, the mindfulness approach that engages the emotions, and sort of not just emotions, but mind states.
I'm just looking down the list of questions now.
Yes.
I think Brendan's got a very common Marxist critique,
Yeah.
question there about it's in a sense, is it as a way of managing mental health? Is it a way of the kind of, I suppose it is a way of increasing productivity and keeping people in the system rather than rebelling against the system?
Yeah, I can't say I've ever encountered that. I mean, apart from in books like Mindfulness, I encounter it in great length. What I do encounter is HR professionals who are concerned about the level of absenteeism and mental health problems, and they want to do something to help. And of course, partly that's because when people go off on stress, they have to pay their wages and they're not working, and that's all that is true. But nonetheless, they actually want to help their staff. So I don't know. If that does happen, then I wouldn't want to be part of it. Sorry, if the really cynical use of mindfulness happens, I wouldn't want to be part of it. But I don't know that you can, even then, I don't know that you can prevent that happening. You can't stop people using techniques, but it's just not my experience. So I am, in that sense, not very sympathetic to that kind of critique. I just don't experience it.
Yeah, it's a kind of, you'd have to see people as kind of productive components, really, for that to work. And what you've said is that then actually it's in a technique for individuals.
Yes, I think it's also based on profound mistrust of companies, private sector companies, which I don't particularly share. I mean, that's one of the ways society is organized.
Profound distrust of the capitalist product, which does, there is a tendency out there to look at people as commodities, and if you can make them more efficient, and mindfulness can make them more efficient, it's that sort of feeling rather than,
Yeah, I'm familiar with the critique. I mean, it's such a cynical view of the organizations concerned. It may be true, accurate in some cases. I don't know really. All I can say is I've never encountered it.
Yes, there's I'm just looking down the list of questions. There's some very detailed ones, actually.
Okay. Bipartisan interest in Parliament.
Yes. So you started off actually by asking some questions about the kind of secular nature of mindfulness.
Yeah.
And a question that came up for me is, do you think that mindfulness has its own sort of set of values that it not necessarily connected to a religious movement as such, but a kind of ethics and a set of values, I guess, that runs through it?
This is the Holy Grail, isn't it? To find something that speaks to people strongly enough that it brings out a set of ethical values without that ethics being based on some sort of authoritarian diktat. I mean, that is the subject of Robert's first book, isn't it? The Theory of Moral Objectivity. That you can find some way to say that values are really objective. With mindfulness, people talk about that as values being implicit in the act of mindfulness, in the act of being mindful. You care more, you are more compassionate, perhaps, because you see I don't know. I think there's some truth in that, but I think that I don't see that it's a very strong basis for a set of values. I think we do need to reflect more widely than just meditating in order to find our moral values. I think there's a lot in the middle way philosophy that helps with that. But again, it's, you know, Robert frames that in as an error focus. So seeing when you're being unmindful, seeing when you're being reactive, seeing when you're making assumptions. But yeah, I think we're really into quite unknown territory with that.
Yeah, and it is, as you say, the holy grail, really.
Yeah,
It is.
I think one of the questions relates to that, about the bipartisan nature of mindfulness. There's more people on the left than the right involved in mindfulness, but there's plenty of people on the right in Westminster. I'm not particularly involved with Westminster work anymore, but yeah, it's always been a cross-party thing. And I did want to caution against the assumption that if everyone starts meditating or something like that, then they'll all end up where we are politically. And we almost always seems to be centre left or a bit further left than that. Almost always.
And
I don't believe it, actually. I mean, I just point you towards our Attorney General, who is a Buddhist and a very sincere Dharma practitioner and really right-wing. Go figure.
No, there's a lot of assumptions, isn't there, about the kind of our experience of the material world, I guess, and our position in it.
Yeah.
And that I'm constantly aware of what social media backing me into a corner of my own reflected political beliefs, and that's sort of how we are, isn't it? So we assume we must be right a lot of the time. There's been a number of people that have reflected and not so much questioned, but the sense that mindfulness is bringing their children or the education system into something other than assessment, that it gives a gap in that, I suppose, a greater recognition for the fact that our schools have become just about assessing people. Would you agree with that?
But well, Catherine Weir will be speaking as part of this, and she's really the person who can speak about that with much greater knowledge and authority. And she's really informed the work, that she's informed what's happening in Wales, and that she and others like her are a movement of people who are really challenging that assessment-based target focus thing. And I suppose my experience is that when that's happening, in any case, then mindfulness can come into that sort of newly emerging approach and offer a practice, offer something that speaks to people very personally and allows for an alternative approach with a lot of depth, potentially. But yes, that's very much a live issue within education. And as I said, in Wales, they've really taken on that the backlash against the target culture, and are engaging a very radical educational experiment, which, if you've never heard about it, I commend it to you to just find out what's happening. And I think a lot of the people here are from the UK, probably mostly from England, and that's part of having a devolved nation, that different social experiments, political experiments, can occur in different countries. And in Wales, that is happening. And then really the question is, can mindfulness be part of that, and can it take it deeper? I have the feeling we've gone over time.
We have gone over time, but I'd like to thank you. I mean, it's given me a lot of food for thought for the next, for the rest of lock-in, whatever that might be. So thank you very, very much. I would encourage everyone to use, to continue this discussion on the Middle Way discussion page, if you so wish to do that. And this has been recorded, this talk, so it'll be available for you to listen to again. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, thank you again for asking me. Thank you for listening, and
yeah,
wish you well through lockdown.
Thank you. And it's, yes, lovely to meet you virtually. Thank you very, very much, Vishvapani. Take